Hi everyone. Today I am finally giving you this long promised video on the poetry of the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam. To Russian speakers, that is Osip Mandelstam. I never actually understood why they usually translate his name with the S sound instead of the sh sound. I mean, we do have the sh sound pretty easily in English. But anyway, so for people that are patrons, you guys know that you're getting this video a bit earlier from the compared to the hoi polloi, and you're also getting a bunch of poems from Mandelstam on top of the one that we're discussing here, which is Leningrad. So if you'd like to get access to that, if you're not a patron, that is patreon.com/automachination. You're going to get not only these poems, but everything that I did on the patron page up until this point, plus access to any future releases. There's actually going to be a patron-only show with a couple of people next week, so that's going to be something else that's coming up. The first poem is his poem Leningrad. This was written in 1930. So this is already when he's had, a bunch of brushes with the law. This is shortly before, right, in the 30s, right, is when he would have his final arrest before his death, right? But he was arrested multiple times. He was always under surveillance, right? If you read Nadezhda's text on Mandelstam's life, right, you get the sense of, everybody was always very, very everybody was always suspicious of each other, right? Even especially the poets that were envious of one another. There was this thing, right, where you could sort of be, given up to the authorities, right? In fact, this is what happened early on with Mandelstam, right? When he was arrested, he was, it was probably because, one of the arrests at least was there was some sort of listener, right, in the audience. He would give multiple readings, different variations of the same poem, and he had this poem called Stalin Epigram, right? And maybe like if he could sort of like go back a little bit, he could have figured out who was that gave him up to the authorities, right, based on the variation they had in his head, right? He himself didn't write down the tall tale, I guess, is that he didn't write anything down. He would just sort of walk, and he would have lines that come into his head, and then he would sort of like put them together orally in that way. There's probably some truth to that, right? I mean, it would be dangerous to put some of these poems to paper, right? And the fact that there are so many different variations going around, that's kind of evidence of, something was memorized and is not being totally remembered in the right way. There's no like official text, but this poem, right, was one that also got him into trouble. And when we read it, I think you'll understand why. So I'm going to give you the Russian version, and then I'm going to give you the English, or you could follow along with the English. I'm giving a somewhat like semi-literal translation of not only this poem, but for the patrons, later poems as well, simply because I want people to understand what is going on literally, right? It's, oftentimes whenever people translate poetry, they want to make it into great English poetry. And, there's definitely a benefit to that, right? There's definitely benefits to writing great poetry in English through translation. At the same time, every, like excellent translation of his poems that I've seen, they're definitely missing what's going on sort of underneath it literally. So that's also a loss, right? It's just difficult, especially maybe even with a language like Russian. It's pretty different from most Western languages. So you're definitely losing some stuff that I want to bring attention to you. So I'll read the Russian and I'll give you the English. Ленинград. Я вернулся в мой город, знакомый до слез, до прожилок, до детских припухлых слез. Ты вернулся сюда, так глотай же скорей рыбий жир ленинградских речных фонарей. Узнавай же скорей декабрьский денек, где зловещему дегтю подмешан желток. Петербург, я еще не хочу умирать. У тебя телефонов моих номера. Петербург, у меня еще есть адреса, по которым найду мертвецов голоса. Я на лестнице черной живу и высок, ударяет мне вырванный с мясом звонок. И всю ночь напролет жду гостей дорогих, шевеля кандалами цепочек дверных. So first thing, before we even get to the English, that you should notice right away is clearly this is a poem that rhymes. The majority of the translations, I think, thankfully, don't try to make it rhyme, because by making some of this rhyme, I think you do lose out on some of the literalness. But most poetry written in Russian, right, especially up until this point, up until Mandelstam's time, it was all pretty much all rhyming, right? It would be very rare to find poetry that is not rhyming. In fact, like off the top of my head, I've definitely, I've read poems that don't rhyme, but I can't even, I can't think of anything off my head that doesn't, right? In fact, there's this odd tradition in Russian music where quite a few poems, right, you will just find they happen to have made songs out of it. Right. In fact, this poem itself, believe it or not, was turned into a pop song by the Russian pop singer Alla Pugacheva, and in her version, right, she's losing a lot, right? So, like, first of all, the reason why the rhyme here works so well in these kinds of couplets is because it sort of taps into what you would normally think of as maybe childhood nostalgia. But because the actual content, right, although there's this kind of like, maybe like a faux veneer, right, like a patina of nostalgia, right, it's this kind of like nostalgia that's in the middle of a tension, right, it's nostalgia at the same time with just like mixed with this idea of there's something here that is both familiar but something I want to keep at arm's length, right? Mandelstam himself tried to like get resettled into St. Petersburg, right, or Leningrad multiple times, right? He never quite successfully did it, right? Petersburg in general, whether you read like Dostoevsky or whatnot, it was always a city that was, it was always like aspirational, right? It was on the one hand, in some ways, even more Western than places like Moscow. And yet in other ways, there's this kind of very old kind of quality to it. Right. So even, the city itself lends itself, right, just kind of situationally to some of this tension. So the fact that there's this kind of rhyme going on, right, it occludes and sort of, or even emphasize, right, it both occludes but also kind of emphasizes the fact that there's also something sinister happening at the same time. The same way that if you guys follow the poetry of James Emmanuel, if you look at my site alexsheremet.com, you see some analysis of the poetry of James Emmanuel. He was a black poet in America, right? He has this poem about the death of Emmett Till, who was murdered allegedly for, the murder is not the allegation. The allegation is that he whistled at a white woman, right? I think that turned out to be false, right, by her admission. I don't know if that's her guilt speaking or literally didn't happen, but whatever the case, right, that was the thought, and he was murdered for this. And that the poem that he wrote about the event, it almost makes it sound like a little fairy tale, right, with the rhyming, very simple sort of rhymes. And this has a similar kind of quality to it. So Alla Pugacheva, when she decided to turn this into a pop song, she's doing two things. First, she is losing the sinister nature of just kind of like the rhymes, right, by making it sound very happy, right? She turns it into a pure kind of nostalgia piece, right? She kind of like screams it out, like, Leningrad, я еще не хочу умирать, right? Like, meaning, I want to see more and more of you. I want to see more and more of you. I love the city. I love the city. On the other hand, right, and maybe this is because she doesn't quite understand the poem, or she might very well understand the poem, and she might just decide, I want to do away with this tension. You notice that it's titled Leningrad, right? But nowhere in the poem does it say the word other than, as an adjective, right? Leningradskih речных фонарей, right? The fish oil of Leningrad's riverside lamps, right? For the most part, when the city itself is being addressed, right? It's Petersburg, right? Petersburg, like he being born in 1891, obviously the name of the city, right, that he was familiar with was named Petersburg at the time of his childhood, right? Leningrad comes after. And so we immediately get this kind of tension, right? The title is Leningrad, and it's made to be this totally exotic thing that he's not familiar with. Just by changing its name, right? The whole thing itself, just it's removed situationally, becomes something else altogether, right? And Alla Pugacheva, maybe she understands this, maybe she doesn't, but the fact is, like, if you do decide to turn a poem like this into a song, and you axe that tension, right? You have to replace it with something else, because by axing that tension, you're making it lesser than what it already is, right? The tension introduces a complication, right? By removing the complication, you have to think like, okay, if I don't want this kind of complication, maybe I should have a different kind of complication. And of course, it doesn't happen anywhere in the song, right? A very silly song. That said, I am using one of her songs for the video that I'm working on, 20 or so of the best Russian songs that I could come up with, right? So I am using one of her songs, but that song in particular happens to be a little silly. So those are the two things I want you to pay attention to even before, right, we get to the English, right? We have the rhymes and we have the tension between the title and the names that are in fact named in the poem itself. So let me just briefly give you the English. Leningrad. I have returned to my city, familiar to tears, to my veins, to swollen childhood glands. You have returned, so gulp quickly the fish oil of Leningrad's riverside lamps. Recognize even sooner a little December day where sinister tar is mixed with an egg yolk. Petersburg, I do not want to die yet. You have my telephone numbers. Petersburg, I still have the addresses by which I will find the voices of dead men. I live in a black staircase, and in my temple strikes to the flesh the ringing. And all night long I await the dear guests shuffling the shackles of door chains. All right, so let's sort of break this down piece by piece. The first two lines. Я вернулся в мой город, знакомый до слез, до прожилок до детских припухлых желез. Right? If you think about great poetry, right, and what is required of great poetry, especially a great poem that is not very long, right? This is not a very, let me see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, right? So it's 14 lines, right? It's about the length of a sonnet, right? And in fact, like, interestingly enough, like structurally, although, this is not like, like a sonnet is like, it's mostly an English thing, right? At least like historically, right? The greatest examples of sonnets that we have, the largest number, right? They happen to be in English. That's not to say they don't exist in Russian or in other languages, but simply by the fact that you have 14 lines, you don't have a whole lot to deal with. You have to say a lot. The way that you're going to do it is you're going to compress everything that you can, right, as tightly as possible, say as much as you can from the very beginning, right? So situationally, we have the title, Leningrad, right? We sort of know where this is going to be or what this is going to be in reference to, right? He says, I've returned to my city, familiar to tears, right? So far, right, there's nothing sinister here, right? Я вернулся в мой город, знакомый до слез. Even in Russian, there's nothing sinister about this. The phrase знакомый до слез, right? It is, it's so familiar to you, right? It's so like within your ken that you're ready to cry about it, right? That's not sinister. That could just very well be just basic nostalgia. But look what happens by the time that you get to just the second line. Look at this turn. To my veins, to swollen childhood glands, the прожилок до детских припухлых желез, right? He is immediately like this, the childhood that he's referencing. It's not just, the thought of the memory. It's also those like, uncomfortable physical experiences, especially if you imagine, right, late 1800s Russia, right? This is not a totally developed country. Granted, wealthier people like Mandelstam and his family, right, did better health-wise than everybody else. But I mean, just imagine, like, the suffering of childhood, right? The proжилок, right? And what exactly is going on with the veins of his, youth? Like, is he having nosebleeds? Is he like, what is he feeling exactly? It's not even explicitly stated, right? The second part you sort of understand, right? Swollen childhood glands, like everybody gets, like, something, whether it's like your tonsils or like whatever, right? You have you often have problems with glands as a child, right? As you grow up, you often grow out of that. You grow out of allergies. Your adrenals start to catch up to the rest of your body. That's part of the reason, at least, why childhood allergies don't necessarily stay with you into adulthood, right? But that's a fairly kind of like bit of a disturbing image, isn't it? Right? And just think of the rhyme, right? And here, слез, right? Tears, желез, right? Tears and glands are made to rhyme. Tears as a function of nostalgia, glands as a function of just physical discomfort, right? Very unexpected. So, second, ты вернулся сюда, ты глотаешь скорее, рыбежи ленинградских речных фонарей, right? You have returned, so gulp quickly. The fish oil of Leningrad's riverside lamps, right? Again, we have that same kind of sense of nostalgia, right? First, we have this kind of, right, kind of like more prosaic, nominal nostalgia, right? You have returned here, right? Sudá, it's, I didn't add that, but it's technically here, right? You've returned here. So gulp quickly. Now, this is another little sinister turn. Exactly what could he be talking about, right? The fish oil of Leningrad's riverside lamps, right? This is both in America as well as in Russia, right? Soviet Union. I remember like when I first started drinking like fish oil as a teenager, my family was like, oh, shit, we used to, be forced to drink this all the time, whether it's by teachers or like by parents or whatever, right? It was a common thing, right? Same thing in America. Like if you ask about kids that grew up in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s, right? Many of them were just like spoon-fed fish oil, right? In Russia, oftentimes it was stuff like cod liver oil, right, for the vitamin A, right? Elsewhere, it might be other things, but anyway, right? It's another kind of childhood image, but it's very twisted, right? So first of all, this idea of gulp quickly, right? It's kind of like you're not even supposed to, question it, right? A parent is telling you, why do you have to drink this? Well, you don't have to, you can't ask. Drink it, right? And don't ask questions. But think about what's going on sort of politically as well, right? This idea of gulp quickly, right? We have on the one hand, this was like used as a punishment, right? Castor oil, right? In fascist Italy, right? It was often used as a torture implement in other, nations as well, right? In the past, right? You drink enough oil, right? Your body ejects it very quickly. This is why people, when they get into stuff like eating coconut oil, they start shitting themselves, like, and they start losing their minds for the first month or so because they're doing too much too quickly, right? But there's this idea that you're being ordered to do this, like almost like in a trance. Go and do this thing that you're told, right? And politically at the time, remember, right? There's this idea of conformity, right? Being forced to do things without questioning. Right? And it's the fish oil of, right? Nominally, this is a childhood image, but I mean, look at this, of Leningrad's riverside lamps, right? It's this disgusting thing of, whatever is, I'm not sure what was burning, right, in those lamps. It could be like whale fat, or maybe it's, something less expensive and less exotic. But it's not something that you're supposed to be eating, right? Now it becomes actually torturous. Right. So just in the first four lines, I mean, think about how much has been compressed, right? And this kind of game that he's playing with you, right? Even this, like, you have returned, right? It's almost like a nominal nostalgia before all the disturbing imagery just comes back in full force, right? So recognize even sooner a little December day where sinister tar is mixed with an egg yolk. I've never seen this line be explained. I wonder if it's because people just sort of pass it over without quite understanding what it means, or if there's like something else going on. But I want to talk about it, right? So Uznavai, скорее, декабрьский денек, где зловещему дегтю подмешан желток. Right, so this word денек, right, the Russian word for day is день, right? That's just kind of the nominal basic word. If you say денек, right, that's a diminutive, right? It's kind of like something like a little day, like once upon a time, or this like little day, that sort of thing. Back here, I remember what I said about how you're being sort of played with, right? You're pulled one direction and the next very quickly, right? So here we have that sort of, we have a command, right, which is a little bit disturbing, right? A command that's kind of like sort of like saying for you to like figure this out faster and faster, right? As if you have an escort sort of like beating you over the head, right? That's another common thing in Russian songs and in Russian poetry, right? There's a Vladimir Vysotsky, who was a Soviet bard, right? He had a bunch of great songs. I'm going to be using also him for the video that I'm working on. And he has this line from this poem, Magadan. Right? Magadan was or is a city in Russia, and it used to be a major gulag as well, right? Very far from the rest of Russia, right? Very cold. He has a song called Magadan, right? And it's about a friend that willingly goes to Magadan just to sort of like live there, not obviously to the camps, but to the city itself, right? And Vysotsky says, Его не будут бить конвой, right? The escort that he's with is not going to be beating him, or rather, there will not even be a convoy or an escort beating him, right? This idea that someone is hurrying you, right? That kind of image of being sort of like perp walked, right? Two cops grab one arm, the other arm. Essentially, civilians in Soviet Russia were oftentimes more or less POWs, like in a sense, right? Right. So it's this mix of like this disturbing thing, right, where you're being shooed and you're being sort of hurried in some way, but then it's this disarming, almost sinister, understatement, this little dinyok, right, where sinister tar is mixed with an egg yolk. To me, I think the image, if you are used to poetry, it should be kind of obvious, right? We're talking about a December day in Petersburg, right? Petersburg tends to be a fairly pasmurna, right? Overcast in December, rainy and snowy and dark in December, right? You don't get a lot of light in December to sort of as a kind of converse what happens for a few weeks in July, August, maybe June, where you have like tons of light, right? You barely have, it's called white nights, right? You barely have any nighttime at all, if at all, actually, right? So imagine, this overcast sort of environment, and he's comparing like those dark clouds, right? It's kind of like a tar, right? And the only hint that you have that there's any sort of light, right? It's maybe behind the clouds or maybe behind the rain. You sort of see, in Russian, it's called gypsy rain, right? Sun showers. You sort of see some of that sun coming out, right? And he's describing it as an egg yolk, right? And it's not an egg yolk that is nice and bright, fully orange in the sky. It's an egg yolk that is beaten and mixed into this tar, right? So that light has been so scattered throughout that it's almost kind of like not a normal day, right? And you were, of course, already sort of, arrested by this original image, right? Декабрьский денек. Right, then we get to the turn, right, and the actual talk of death, right? Petersburg, I do not want to die yet. You have my telephone numbers, right? He's, who is he exactly reaching out to, right? Is there anybody, right? He's sort of doing this entreaty to Petersburg. You're saying, you have my number, right? Is this kind of thing that, people might say to someone that hasn't called them in a while or has sort of fallen out of contact, right? You have my phone numbers, but who's he addressing? He's addressing Petersburg, right? But there is no Petersburg. We know that the only city that exists here is Leningrad, right? There is no Petersburg here. There's only Leningrad. Petersburg, I still have the addresses by which I will find the voices of dead men. So this word Mертвецов, right? Mертвец, you could translate it as a corpse. Oftentimes, like I see this in like slightly more poetic translations being kind of like the voices of the dead. Now you could do that, but definitely in Russian there's this kind of like mертвец, right? This it's it's turning it into a noun that is specific to like, you know, like a figure, right? A person, right? There's some kind of like personhood there, right? Of course, it's applied to, you know, a corpse, right? But there's this idea that this used to be a person, right? And not just like of an animal, right? Well, I actually don't even know off the top of my head, like if you would, you know, easily use it in reference to an animal, but it's this like idea, right, that this is a dead person, right? Like, but also corpse seems, especially in this context, a little bit too harsh. So I guess like a good in between state from the poetic implications and the corpse implications. I'm just gonna say dead men, right? Mертвецов, right? I think as a literal translation, this works fairly well for that. Right. And again, he says, you know, I still have the addresses, right? And this is where that turns. So like at the beginning, right, he's saying that you have my telephone numbers. If you want to have this, you know, like contact me, right? I want to know what's going on, right? That's not going to happen because he's in the wrong city, isn't he? Right. Here he says, I still have the addresses, right? But then he tells you the reality, right? I'll find the voices of dead men, right? It's not going to be the reality that I would hope that it is. All right, so the last four lines. «И на лестнице черной живу, и высок ударяет мне вырванный с мясом звонок». I live in a black staircase, and in my temple strikes to the flesh the ringing. And there's a few things to say about this. So first of all, I remember like when I was reading this recently with one of my relatives, we were talking about the poem, and she said like, oh yeah, like when you would walk around Leningrad, even in the 50s or the 60s, you'd go see friends, you'd go see people. Oftentimes you'd come up to their, you know, you'd come up to their doors and you would see an electronic doorbell, right? But it would oftentimes be sort of ripped out, right? It would be ripped out and you'd see sort of just the wires. Sometimes you would just have to like interact with the wires, that kind of thing. Right? Perhaps this is something that was already going on. At the same time, it's not even, you know, necessarily clear that he's talking about some sort of electronic doorbell, right? This thing's vanok, right? I'm translating it as a ringing. Oftentimes, they're sort of turning this into like almost like a church bell in some of the translations that I see, but zvanok, like literally, it could, you know, it could just be like the ringing of a telephone, right? It could be the ringing of a doorbell. It could be the ringing of a church bell, right? It could be ringing, you know, more casually or more generically, right? And this phrase "to the flesh," right? It's a little bit hard to say exactly the best way to translate this, simply because this is idiomatic Russian, right? Vyrvanny smyasem literally means ripped out with the flesh, or ripped out all the way to the flesh itself as well, right? Imagine like you could even use this in totally unrelated situations. Like imagine, you know, you have, you know, a garden full of vegetables and you come up to one of the vegetables and you rip it out, right? When you rip it out, obviously what's going to happen is you're going to get dirt, you're going to get worms, you're going to get all the roots, right? All of that is going to come out with the vegetable itself, right? And you would say in Russian, right? Oh, this thing, right? Vyrvanny smyasem, right? Referring to the roots, right? They're sort of like anthropomorphizing this thing that you see, right? Whether it's wires, right? Or whether it's roots, or like any other kind of like a similar situation, it would work, right? But in this case, right? Using this idiomatically works especially nicely given how just, you know, I want to say the word sensual in the literal sense, right? It's not sensual. It's not positive connotation. Like oftentimes when we say sensual, there's a positive connotation, right? There's just kind of like a sheer kind of physicality here, right? The slyoz, pripuchli желез, right? Gulp quickly the fish oil of Leningrad's riverside lamps, right? This egg yolk, right? This thing that has at least, the implication of life or flesh or something, right? This is the thing, right? And it's been smashed, right? So there's no more, right? A smashed egg yolk is not ever going to become a chicken in that situation, right? So in every case, it's a kind of sensuality in the purely physical, right? Almost discomforting, gluttonous sense of the word, right? So as an idiom, right, this works very nicely in the context of the poem, right? And this is something that I wanted to highlight. And of course, the last two lines. И всю ночь напролет жду гостей дорогих, шевеля кандалами цепочек дверных. Right? And all night long, I await the dear guests, shuffling the shackles of door chains. Right? This idea of dear guests, right? It's usually, I guess, interpreted as it could be like police officers coming to get you, right? It could be the special police, right? It could be the security agents, that kind of thing. You could simply be in the more kind of I guess abstract sense, you're being listened in on, right? And you're constantly this just could be apparitions in your head, right? You're always worried about these people coming, right? And this шевеля кандалами цепочек дверных, right? It's not even necessarily even that clear, right? Like you could see it even in the English as well. This kind of like I'm not sure technically what it would be called, like a gerund, right? This kind of active verb of like shuffling, right? Same thing here, шевеля, right? It's not even it's you can't say grammatically in English or in Russian that the dear guests are the ones shuffling the shackles of door chains, right? You don't know if it's the person sitting at home that is letting in these guests, right? If you're going to do this as a reading, let's say that you are someone living in Leningrad and you are not ever going to be picked up by the secret police, right? You're never going to be in prison. You're never going to go to a gulag. Right, let's say that that's not going to be your fate. You could still very much be scared, right? You could still very much be scared, and by being scared, you could be in the situation where these are all just kind of apparitions in your own head, right? And maybe you walk eventually towards that destruction. You yourself are the ones that ends up opening the door. But even here, right, we're not even talking about any opening of a door, right? We're just talking about the shuffling of the shackles, right? And it's not even of the door, right? Like it's this odd thing, right? Shevля kandalami, it's a Portuguese, right? We have the shackles and then we have the chains themselves, right? Totally separate words in Russian, separate words here in this translation in English. But nonetheless, right? It's made to be something that you could interpret from any kind of like direction, right? Or rather, not any, but a set of directions where a few different things can work to fill out this puzzle, right? The point of these poems is not even to necessarily get to one definitive interpretation, right? We're not looking for that. We're looking for a crew of interpretations that make sense in this kind of puzzle, right? In the end, when you pick up this puzzle, right? When you complete the puzzle, right? It's something that should be kind of blurry. It should be something you're definitely making out the forms. You definitely understand what the subject is. You definitely understand that, but there should be a kind of blur, right, inherent to it. All right, so that's Leningrad. I don't have much else to say about this poem. Guys, if you are patrons, please stick around, and we will get to the other three poems that I will analyze in this same way from Mandelstam. If you're not a patron, again, patreon.com/automachination, and you could get access to that. Thank you guys for watching. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll come back with some new stuff very soon. If you're a patron, please stick around.